According to Yakut beliefs, each person is endowed with 3 souls on earth. Only in their combination does a person find his integrity, and having lost one of them, he loses his inner harmony.
If you ever find yourself here in Yakutia, you'll discover the memory of an English hero you've almost certainly never heard of.
Kate Marsden is this woman who has a mission to try to eradicate leprosy throughout the world.
Кейт Марсден все от нее зависящее делала для служения страждущих, поэтому не случайно ее почитатели при жизни уже называли ее ангелом милосердия.
This was a dreadful journey she did because she went across Siberia by sledge and horseback.
Kate Marsden's journey was an absolutely epic undertaking. She was a real pioneer, a woman before her time.
Imagine doing that a century ago when there were no safety nets, no travel insurance, no one coming to rescue you if anything went wrong.
Kate Marsden took with her this practical humanity, and that's what has spread all over that part of Russia, is this caring for other people.
And she was tough. This is the main thing about Kate. She was a really tough, determined woman. She didn't let anything or anybody stop her doing what she thought was right.
It was sufferers of leprosy that really pulled at her heartstrings, and she tackled everything that people could throw at her and still kept on striving.
It's one thing to hear a rumour of a magical herb in a distant part of the world. It's quite another to make the radical decision that you're personally going to go and find it yourself.
That's true dedication. That's true dedication to the cause of the lepers in Siberia.
This formidable looking woman wasn't an explorer, she was a nurse on a mission.
The world should know about Kate Marsden because her objectives, her mission are still with us.
So she's a hero, a very courageous lady, and I think that's worth celebrating.
Here there are streets named after her, statues. They have parades on her birthday and award scholarships in her name. In her heyday, she was the darling of Russian royalty and earned the admiration of the Tsarina. In the West, she was subjected to a vicious and sustained campaign of character assassination. It branded her a liar, heaped discredit on her work, and ruined her reputation. The scandal followed her until her dying day.
She was let down by her fellow women, actually.
It's a great shame that she's largely been forgotten in England.
This film sets out to establish once and for all whether she deserved the character assassination that was heaped on her by her enemies and critics.
Кейт Марсден – это символ такого взаимопонимания и доброго сотрудничества как между Российской империей и Британской империей того времени, между церковью Англии и между Русской православной церковью, между Российским императорским домом и Королевским домом Великобритании.
Well, it all boiled down to this one simple question. Was Kate Marsden a saint or a sinner?
One of the souls is maternal. It goes to man as a representative of humanity. All life on earth exists for a reason. Everything is interconnected, and everything has a purpose. And sometimes, a person, having been born, also finds his destiny. Sometimes we forget about it. We prefer to just go with the flow. This is our right and our choice. Only a few of us can understand and accept our path and follow him no matter what.
The year is 1891 and we're in the remotest part of the vast Russian Empire. Nobody came here apart from a handful of government officials, the odd missionary and those that were sent into exile. And look at how she was travelling on the back of a Yakut horse, which may be small in stature but is really wild in spirit, and using a traditional Yakut saddle which is made of wood. Even if you cover this thing in blankets, it's going to be incredibly uncomfortable. Add to that the bears and the rough terrain. This is the image of Kate Marsden that first got me hooked on her story. She appears as this fabulous female Indiana Jones figure, riding astride, which in itself was really unusual for a woman at that time. She's dressed in a full leather outfit, complete with a skirt to cover her modesty. On one side she's got a revolver, on the other is lashed a whip, and she's leading a team of at least a dozen flint-hard Yakut Cossacks, also on horseback, and they're about to head out together into the unknown. This is the vision of a woman that I'm prepared to admire as a hero. Kate Marsden herself explains the story in her writings and in newspaper articles. She talks about being still a very young nurse when she first came across someone who had leprosy. And she describes being so shocked by the awfulness of the disease that she decided there and then that this was going to be the cause that she would devote her life to.
Imagine that you're someone who has suddenly been diagnosed with leprosy. The next day, your family throws you out of the house. Suddenly, you have no home. You cannot get a job because no one will employ you because of the stigma. Your chances of survival are actually very, very low.
So she started off amazingly, even when she was as a late teen. She went to nurse in the Russian-Turkish war to support the Russian Red Cross there. And that, for someone who was 17 or 18, was an astounding experience in itself, to be back from the battlefields and see wounded men coming in and deal with people who are suffering all sorts of diseases. It was horrific.
It was while researching the latest and most modern methods of looking after people that had contracted leprosy that she first heard a rumour about a magical herb that was used to fix people in a very far-flung part of the world, the very northeast of Siberia. This was a place where nobody went apart from condemned convicts and very hardy explorers. And yet, on hearing this rumour about this people, the Yakut, that had a magical herb that could apparently cure leprosy as well as all sorts of other disorders, she makes the radical decision that she herself is going to go to this edge of the world and find this herb. And not only that, but she's going to convince these people, who are apparently very secretive about the healing powers, to let her bring this herb, this magical cure, to the rest of the world.
As a long rider myself, and having travelled thousands of miles, I can't even begin to comprehend what she must have endured doing the journey that she did. The temperatures, the mosquitoes for another thing, absolutely horrendous. And just the long hours and the high mileage that she was doing, it's almost inconceivable to me. Yeah, incredible, absolutely incredible.
So, having established herself in Moscow and done the most she can to get her preparations together, she gets the train, first of all, eastwards, and then goes by sledge across, ultimately to Irkutsk at the bottom of Lake Baikal. In each of these stops, at the post houses and at the town, she often visits prison. She's invited and talks to the local dignitaries of the area. From Irkutsk, she then goes north on a tarantass, and when they pick up the River Lena on a barge and travel north by this point to Yakutsk.
It's difficult for us to appreciate today just what an undertaking it was to travel to Yakutia. In modern times, I've made the journey from Moscow to Yakutsk in a vehicle. We drove more than 500 kilometres every day, and the journey still took us more than a month. In 1891, Marsden could only go so far by train from Moscow. After that, she relied on horse-drawn sledges. These are unsprung, so she would have felt every bump, and they're completely exposed to the elements. she travelled with a Russian-speaking friend, Ada Field, and the pair of them wore so many layers of blankets and furs that they were completely helpless once they were loaded into the back of the sledge.
Английская сестра милосердия говорит, встретилась здесь в Якутии с удивительно духовным, мудрым и деятельным архипастырем, епископом Милетием Якимовым, который прославлен Русской Православной Церковью как святой. Епископ Милетий создал миссионерское братство имени Всемилостивого Спаса. И одной из функций этого братства была забота о людях, болящих проказой, о тех колониях, которые существовали, колониях прокаженных, которые существовали у нас в Якутии.
Arriving in Yakutsk, she was confronted with this exotic culture and with a wildness that I imagine she had probably never experienced before. This place is intimidating to anybody. And yet, arriving in Yakutsk, she started to hear not just of the herb, but of the people that had contracted leprosy and that were outcasts in this wild taiga, not being cared for by anybody. So she decides that having reached the end of the world, she's going to go even further. She gets on her horse, she arranges a company of mounted Yakut Cossacks. These are as hard as they come, they're flint hard. And yet there she is, the only woman in this party of 30, heading off into the taiga to this place, Viloisk, a tiny little village.
Angliyattan kalbik kıskırda ulahan arayda bugün köyür kumar amayıp tohta kaytan turar kemen onu ol debekke kene bu arangırı haktar kıtar hedderin bardın nehliyeklerinden keritelir onunla kine etitinden bollağına bu bilükten çugas hortoğa desirge olurı haktar munyallar.
As extreme as Yakutia is in winter, it's equally extreme in summer. So we have temperatures right now down to minus 40 degrees centigrade in winter. In summer it can be plus 40 degrees centigrade. Imagine being in that heat, on horseback, dressed in a full leather outfit to protect you from the biting ticks and the mosquitoes, ticks which carry a disease that can paralyse you within 24 hours. She was riding with a group of men who were used to this environment. Every night she'd have to sleep on the ground under a small canvas tent, and they were surviving off of rations of dried bread and tea. It was no pleasure trip. Arriving in Yakutsk, she hears of the plight of the local people that have contracted leprosy. They're outcast into this wild taiga with nobody looking after their welfare. So she decides that rather than go home, she's going to carry on and plunge herself deeper into the taiga, further into the unknown, to find these people and find out for herself what their situation is.
To ikingen haytar üre haret. Onna kalen iki mosta tutanlar jabo mostanan o üre haktarga to granısı kutuk bolar. Üre haktar bulmanı toravatır. Kinenge jabo mostadan tiyenler astarın, tanastarın ijen kaldırılır bit.
Arriving in Viloisk, she made trip after trip back out into that terrifying nature. This is a place that's full of real and imagined dangers. Not only are there bears and insects, but the people that she was with would have believed that these forests were full of spirits, some good and some very bad. This was a whole new landscape. And in those woods, already terrifying, she came across horrendous nightmares. People that had been cast out of their society. But what exactly was this disease? What is it now, and what was it then?
The reason for the stigma attached to leprosy comes from, I think, two sources. The first is the Hebrew Bible and its translations. And what that came to mean to people was that leprosy was a punishment from God for sin. At the same time, when there's no cure for leprosy, the only way that you can try to stop it spreading is to quarantine the people who have the disease. And that means putting them in what used to be called leper colonies. But given the added stigma, people were very willing to shut leprosy sufferers away and forget about them.
И печаль этой болезни, то, что людей, вот неизвестно как заразившись этой болезнью, выгоняли за пределы села, за пределы города, ставили вне социума. Эти люди влачили жалкое существование, страдая от болезни. И святитель Милетий первый обозначил эту проблему на уровне очень большого и солидного издания.
So they lived in the most utter degradation and poverty. And no one would come to visit them. No relatives would want to know them. They were, for all intents and purposes, they were dead in the world as they lived.
Кейт Марсден очень прекрасный пример в этом плане, потому что, будучи рожденной здесь, в пределах современного Большого Лондона, она не боялась далеких путешествий, обошла своими стопами на кораблях, на санях, на лошадях, путешествия по самым отдаленным уголкам мира, смогла не только донести до жителей этих мест весть благую о Христе Спасителе, но и своим деятельным участием в жизни этих людей, особенно страждущих, страдающих от различных заболеваний, могла облегчить их страдания, организовать необходимую помощь для того, чтобы они могли в тех местах, где они проживали, найти и необходимую медицинскую поддержку, обеспечение, и быть утешены в духовном плане.
Another soul is air. The air soul is what makes us something more than our body. Perhaps this is our mind, character, talent, our dreams, everything that creates our personality. What makes each of us special. We're all human, but we're all different. And sometimes what distinguishes us makes us incomprehensible, alienates us, and the further we are from each other, the more difficult it is for us to take a step towards rapprochement. Sometimes the difference becomes an insurmountable obstacle.
Marsden was confident that if she went to the people of Yakutia with the message that she didn't want the herb for herself, but for the good of all, as she put it, in the name of Christ. She also thought that the fact she was a woman would be an advantage, but she did have one truly remarkable ace up her sleeve, a stroke of luck that fell into her lap and that she made maximum use of. A letter from the Tsarina, the Empress of Russia herself. And in this letter, the Tsarina commanded all the subjects of the Russian Empire to lend Marsden any assistance that she required on her quest. It's impossible to overstate the influence and authority this letter would have carried. It literally gave Marsden the ability to go anywhere, see and do anything she wanted. It gave her the freedom of the empire. How on earth did she manage to get this golden ticket of a letter?
So Kate Marsden goes to the Crimea as a nurse. There she sees the full horrors of leprosy and obviously also of war wounds and injuries for the first time. She becomes a hero then to Russians.
В то время, когда Кейт Марсден, уже имея опыт своего служения в отдаленных частях света, таких как Новая Зеландия или Гавайские острова, отправилась с миссией уже в далекую Сибирь, благоприятным условием и залогом, мы можем сказать, успешности ее поездки было близкое родство русской императорской семьи и королевской семьи Британии, и императрица России Мария Федоровна, и будущая королева Англии, а в то время принцесса Уэльская Александра, и, будучи родными сестрами, очень по-доброму и с полным использованием возможных для них средств и методов оказали поддержку этой миссии. И Кейт Марсден именно в этот период было особенное сближение иерархов того времени, богословов, которые искали точки соприкосновения, потому что и Русская Православная Церковь, и Церковь Англии были немного изолированы от общеевропейского процесса, где главную роль играли католические страны или страны лютеранского направления протестантизма. И вот поэтому такой поиск точек соприкосновения говорил о большом будущем на то время британско-российских отношений и отношений между Русской Православной Церковью и Церковью Англии.
Kate Marsden in the 1880s went with her mother to New Zealand, and she arrived 5 days before her sister died. So that must have been an awful shock. So they're suddenly there, they have no money, no work or whatever, and then Kate Marsden gets a job as a matron of a hospital in New Zealand, and that's an amazing thing. And then there's an issue with the chief surgeon in the hospital, and allegations of drinking. She has a fall in a linen closet that leads eventually to her leaving her post, and so she's physically ill, but definitely mentally ill as well, and struggling with a lot of things. So for a few years she's in New Zealand without work, but starting to recuperate, and she starts lecturing on nursing and going out to the local communities, and that's the beginning of her building herself back up again and doing things for other people. And at the same time, there's a man called Father Damien who's helping lepers in Hawaii, very, very famous, so the papers are all full of him and what he's done, and she's inspired by Father Damien's work, and that is the true introduction, I believe, to the idea of doing something for leprosy sufferers. So she goes back to England with this aim of helping leprosy sufferers. I think it's still at that point in Hawaii, but she's unable to go there because she's not a Roman Catholic. But the momentum is building there in terms of her efforts and energy, and just a few good connections, and suddenly she's operating within a different circle. She was coming from a very ordinary middle class family, but a few good meetings with sort of the upper classes, and then you start to be invited to talk about your nursing and what you're doing, and I can see that this momentum continues to grow, and the enthusiasm for it, and everybody loves a heroine or somebody who's got great ambitions to help people. So the idea of helping lepers, not in Hawaii, she can't do that, but maybe India, and then she has an audience with the Queen, and it's all, the momentum continues to build, and then she's invited to go to Russia, where she meets the Empress, to be rewarded for her work in the Russian-Turkish War. But then this story, or the information comes about the leprosy sufferers in Siberia, and of course, if you're encouraged by royalty to go to Siberia to help them, why would you not, particularly if there's a possible tale of a herb or a cure for it? So at that point, her path is now begins to be set.
И это издание «Якутские епархиальные ведомости» читали всюду. И есть одна из версий, что именно поэтому английская сестра милосердия Кэт Марсден и едет в Вилюйск. Она узнает именно из прочтения якутских епархиальных ведомостей о том, что в Вилюйске есть большая очень группа прокаженных, есть какое-то подобие колонии, в которой собирает и лечит этих больных.
Kate Marsden was a real pioneer in her day as a woman travelling alone and facing such hardships as Siberian winter. It was almost unheard of back then, even for a woman to do such an amazing thing. Even nowadays, if a woman turned around and said, I'd like to go and do that alone and travel across Siberia, not knowing the language, not knowing the culture, people would laugh, they would tell you can't do it, they tell you you're crazy. So for her in her day, in a very restrictive society that saw females as very weak and unable to do things for themselves, that was an absolutely incredible undertaking.
When she arrives in Villisk or towards that area, there are two possibly slightly disappointing things. Firstly, from other people's perspective, there aren't hundreds and hundreds of leprosy sufferers. She finds 70 or 80, all of whom live in appalling conditions. So it's an awful humanitarian moment, but it's not the headline number of hundreds of sufferers that maybe other people would have expected. Secondly, the herb that she was looking for is not actually the cure-all that everybody was hoping for.
I believe that there was a herb, but it wasn't effective. And for the next 20 or 30 years, medical scientists looked at things like that herb to see whether they could extract from it something that would actually alleviate at least the symptoms of the disease. And those efforts went on throughout the first half of the 20th century. In the 1960s, they did discover a drug, a different drug, which actually did help cure leprosy. But unfortunately, it was a drug to which the virus rapidly became resistant. In the 1980s, they finally put together a mixture of 3 drugs called the multi-drug treatment, and that does cure leprosy if taken for a year. From 1990, that has been available free to governments throughout the world from the World Health Organization. But still today, 200,000 new cases are notified to the World Health Organization every year.
Конечно, как всякий подвижник, и как всякий честный священник, он пытался решать и эту проблему. И мы знаем, что в Сосновке в первые строения этой больницы для прокаженных были инициированы именно им. Епископ Милетий передал ей траву лекарственную, которая помогала лечить эту страшную болезнь. Ну вот, думаю, что современный мир. Но в нашей истории трава, которая, быть может, лекарственная трава, которая послужила поводом приезда сюда, в Якутию, Кэт Марсен, положила начало очень большой и правильной работе заботы о прокаженных, создания больницы, достаточно хорошей на то время, которая просуществовала очень долго.
She found the herb and took it back with her to Moscow and the UK and sent samples to places like Norway. But they never found any benefits of the herb, and exactly what it was became lost in her story. So in fact, her greatest achievements in coming here were her actions while she was in Yakutia rather than the herb. As she approached these small communities of people suffering with leprosy, she approached them in a way that the locals had never seen before. These were people that had been ostracised, that had been deliberately shunned, that were seen as a danger to the rest of the community. And yet Kate Marsden, as she found these small groups of people living out in the taiga, deliberately went up to them, not showing any fear. She would sit with them in their dwellings, would shake their hands, would help them make meals. In displaying such care and empathy, Kate Marsden changed local attitudes and inspired more compassion towards these unfortunate and desperate people.
After she went, the lepers were never cast out in the snow again. They were never treated like that again. They had a hospital, and that was the end. And so, if you think about it, it was like the birth of social work out there in that part of Russia. that people think, no, we have to treat people better.
So there was an expectation that she arrives, ta-da, and has to work from scratch. And actually, that's not the case. The doctors have already investigated the area, but this means that that her arrival is provides energy, really, to make things happen. It's not so much that she does think herself, but it draws attention, because suddenly everybody in the area realises that people in Moscow and St. Petersburg are looking at what's going on out in this area of Yakutia, miles and miles away, and the attention is focused on them. So that starts getting people going within the local community to really make a difference. So part of what she's doing there is helping drive people forward to find a site for a hospital and get the initiatives in place to build an environment where the leprosy sufferers can come and be cared for in a proper space.
When Kate Marsden made her final journey home to London, she arrived to be feted as a heroine. She was showered with the highest accolades. She was made one of the first female members of the Royal Geographical Society. She was awarded a nursing medal, something she shared with Florence Nightingale. She was constantly quoted in the press with long interviews. And then she was invited into the drawing rooms of the elite, all who wanted to know every detail of her extraordinary journey.
She was dedicated to trying to find a way to help the sufferers of leprosy. And she then spends all her energies in raising the money which builds the first leprosy hospital in Yakut.
When she goes back, the fundraising continues both in Russia and in Europe. Writing her book is a key component of that. She is not a natural writer, Kate Marsden. She's an energetic person. She's great at talking, great at public speaking. I can imagine this would have been quite hard for her to have sat down and written an account of what she was doing, so she had help doing that. But she is very conscious that people may challenge her. They may not believe that she went as far as she did. So the book is full of endorsements and statements by other people who were with her, and that shows, it reflects the environment she was operating in, and that she was worried, even when she was writing this, that people might say, no, a woman wouldn't go so far, it wasn't really like that. So it's important that she's got these statements down there.
She gets together leading Catholic citizens in 1895 and founded the St. Francis Leprosy Guild with the intention of providing help and support to leprosy sufferers throughout the world.
And then finally, the ultimate honour. She was granted an audience with Queen Victoria. Travelling to Balmoral, Kate dressed in her best nurse's uniform to meet with the monarch and personally report on what she'd found in Siberia. Queen Victoria must have been extraordinarily impressed, because shortly afterwards, Kate was presented with a golden brooch, apparently from Queen Victoria's personal collection, and that was accompanied by a note expressing the monarch's deep admiration for her work. Establishing the Kate Marsden Leper Fund, she started to amass serious money, both from her speaking and from her writing, and all this money was destined to be sent back to Siberia. She repeatedly expressed that her intention was to come back here herself to help run the leprosarium, which by this point was already being built. And here it is. These are the buildings that were built to help the lepers here in Wilewisk, thanks to the efforts and work of Kate Marsden. She was on course to achieve everything that she had set out to do, to realise a huge ambition. So why have I never heard of her?
But the very first of human souls is earthly. This is a piece of the soul of the earth itself, which unites a person with everything that exists, makes them part of the universe. So, earth is also given to a person as a representative of their people, fills their ancestors with strength, stores and protects them. I think that here in Yakutia, Kate Marsden not only left something important, but also gained something herself. Perhaps it was here that she found what she was looking for the most, her true self. and the Yakult land will always keep the memory of her, and part of this land will always belong to her.
The criticism began before she'd even got back to London. At first, it was perfectly legitimate questions raised by very credible publications. The British Medical Journal claimed that the herb had already been extensively analysed and found to be completely useless. It also questioned the need for her work, saying that raising such funds and going to such effort for such a relatively small number of people, maybe as few as 60 lepers, was totally unnecessary. They raised the good point that the British Empire had plenty of people suffering from leprosy within its own domain, and that the Russian Empire, one of the richest in the world, was perfectly capable of looking after its own.
Когда мы касаемся ее биографии, то видим, что, конечно, ее труды и деятельность незаслуженно забыты, или, по крайней мере, не столь широко известны в наши дни. И видя на примере Кейт Марсден, как она преодолевала трудности, которые ставила перед ней жизнь, и как она могла быть в добрых отношениях и с представителями своих соотечественников в Великобритании, хотя здесь тоже не все принимали ее с распростертыми объятиями, как она могла наладить контакты с новой, незнакомой для нее жизнью в российской глубинке. Мы на ее примере должны научиться тоже преодолевать те трудности, которые не только стоят перед каждым из нас, и иногда возникают и в отношениях между нашими странами, между нашими церквями. Вот именно пример доброго и конструктивного сотрудничества, который явлен в служении Кейт Марсден, должен стать девизом для созидания полезных и взаимовыгодных отношений между нашими культурами в наши дни.
She was operating in an environment where people just wrote letters all the time, often not polite ones. So there's this whole stream of letters flying backwards and forwards, just as now you would have on social media, people commenting about things. Gossip goes backwards and forwards between people. Now it takes longer than it does on Twitter or Facebook, but it's still the same thing. It's just people make snide comments and then somebody else amplifies it, and it just goes around and round and round. So there's no difference in one respect to how she was operating then to how people operate now. It just took slightly longer, but
over time, this criticism developed into asking whether, as well as unnecessary, her journey might have been hugely exaggerated. People suggested that the travelling hadn't been nearly as far or as arduous as she made out. Eventually, they accused her as being an outright liar and that the whole thing had been a hoax.
She knew that her hospital was built, but she was never allowed to go back to Russia because, of course, scandal hit her. And the scandal really was generated by her main detractors who were jealous of her, that she'd muscled her way into Russia. She was fated there. They loved her, and she had lots and lots of help, and her main detractors were jealous of that. And she was scorned and had horrible things written about her. And when her book was published, which this is her book here, the reviews were terrible. They didn't even believe that she'd gone. And this was a dreadful journey she did, because she went across Siberia by sledge and horseback. And I can only imagine what that's like.
But by far the loudest criticism came from the New Zealand press. She'd originally earned their antagonism by claiming in an interview that she had tended to leprous Maoris while on the South Island of the country. New Zealand took this as a slur on their nation, claiming that there had never been leprosy in New Zealand, not amongst the European or the Maori population. And they were right, leprosy has never been there. So maybe Marsden was lying, or maybe she'd just been mistaken. But either way, the New Zealand press started raking over her time in the colony and they came up with tabloid gold. There were whiffs of insurance fraud. She'd had an accident at work in very dubious circumstances shortly after taking not one, but 2 insurance policies out. Gossip gathered pace as it emerged that Marsden had left a trail of debts right the way across Europe and across Russia too. It turned out that she'd used imaginary estates in New Zealand that didn't exist. And there were accusations that much of the money that had been donated towards her new leper fund had instead gone towards funding her travels and her lifestyle. A committee of her friends was set up in St. Petersburg to try and dismiss the rumours and reassert her integrity. So it was a devastating blow when the committee published a letter in the Times saying that all the accusations were entirely true. Marsden tried to fight back and maintained her innocence, but it was useless. Now that there was such a big question mark over her integrity, there was nowhere to go. It was the end of the road. Funding dried up and allies became enemies.
She was let down by her fellow women. Men she encountered generally were pretty supportive of what she was doing. And they sometimes thought, well, maybe she wasn't very good with money, or she wasn't very reliable in some respects, but they acknowledged that what she was doing was a great thing, and they admired her for that. Women, though, you would expect to be really supportive, but actually, although she had some women followers, many women just either through jealousy or skepticism about the inappropriateness of her life or doubt about her ambition just really did not help her. And the problems that arose were all driven by her fellow women.
Only later did the full circumstances of that article in the Times come to light. The author of the article stated privately that they had only confirmed Marsden's financial wrongdoings so that the public would assume it was the greater offence. Greater than what? If you're anything like me, you're probably feeling a little bit disappointed at this point in the story. Where is Kate Marsden, the inspiration, riding off into the Taiga to make the world a better place? Instead, we're confronted with evidence that can't easily be explained away simply by Victorian homophobia, that Marsden did some pretty terrible things in her past, things that we can't excuse. Instead of looking at Kate the hero, now we're faced with Kate the human. And if we're going to look at Kate Marsden as a human, we need to look right back to where she came from. This was a woman whose story was full early on with some of the realities of life. She was still a child when her father died. And then at the age of 19, so while still a teenager, she was sent to be a nurse in one of the most brutal, bloody wars of the entire century. She would have been faced in that field hospital with gruesome injuries, with evidence of man's brutality with man right in front of her. That's got to have affected her. Then she started to lose her siblings, one by one, to the family disease, consumption, a disease that she herself also suffered from. Most likely, she considered that her life would not be a long one. This was a woman who, in many ways, didn't have much to lose. So I don't think it's too much of a leap to imagine that Kate Marsden coming here, seeing what she witnessed in the Taiga and feeling that she could actually do some good here, maybe that was enough to change her. And when you look at the allegations against her, most of them, if not all, predate her time in Siberia. So perhaps we're looking at a woman that did do bad things in her past, but came here and realised that she could make a difference and at the same time achieve that redemption that she was after. If you read her writings, it's full of a grief, a guilt, a sorrow that she never entirely explains, but which I suspect referred back to things that she'd done in her past that she wasn't proud of. And really, I think that makes her very human. At the heart of this story, we're asked to make a decision. about whether her achievements here in Siberia allow us to forget the deeds of her past, whether we're allowed to give her that second chance and admire her for what she did here.
Sosnovka is where Kate Marsden's leper colony was built, where of course there's now a psychiatric hospital on the footprint. And as we arrived in Sosnovka, there was people waiting all the way down an avenue, which I had to go down, and they were all waving at me and singing in national costume as I walked down this avenue towards where the leper colony was. And near the end, I walked into a field, and I had people on either side of me, and I had people filming me, and as I walked in, there was about 100 people in full national costume. Absolutely the most beautiful costume on the planet. You know, it's just there is nothing to beat the costumes from that part of Siberia. And then I even felt that love even more, and I was thinking, Kate Marsden never went back and saw her leper colony built. That ceremony was almost hers. It was the most remarkable moment.
Just 10 years before she died, Kate Marsden wrote a second book. And what she chose to call that book tells you everything you need to know. She called it My Travels in Siberia, a Vindication. In it, she told her side of the story, decrying what she saw as her vilification. Both her time in Siberia and her excommunication from the project that followed haunted Kate Marsden until the very end. But by that time, the great British public neither remembered nor cared about the nurse that had gone on a mission in Siberia. They may have forgotten about her, but people here in Siberia never did.
There have been people helping lepers ever since there was leprosy. In the medieval times, there were orders of knights who helped lepers. The one that is most important to the St. Francis Leprosy Guild and was very important to Kate Marsden is St. Francis. St. Francis was a saint whose father was very rich, and he gave away all his father's money to the poor. And he is known as a great supporter and helper of lepers, and that was in the 13th century. And through his auspices, places where lepers would be looked after more humanely were founded. And indeed there were leprosy hospitals in Britain, in Europe, from then on. Our organisation and Kate Marsden's part in it takes that Franciscan idea of charity, of helping the poor, the sick, to this day.
Her driving force was her desire to make a positive difference in the world, and she tackled everything that people could throw at her and still kept on striving. It was really important that she followed her heart and her beliefs to deliver some goodness around the place.
The leprosarium that Kate Marsden worked so hard to make happen was built and was very successful. Even today, it's credited for driving leprosy out of Yakutia once and for all, and it only shut in the 1960s. And then, in the same village, they created the Kate Marsden Hospital for Mental Illnesses. Not only that, but in this village, they are building a church that they're going to name after Kate Marsden. There's a museum that tells her story, and not one, but 2 statues. And this year, it's being rebuilt as a modern facility that is going to serve the entire region for generations to come.
We opened to the public in 1914, but our story begins in 1912 when Kate Marsden moved to Bexhill, and she almost straight away began planning a project for the town's first ever museum. She got together with a gentleman called Reverend Thompson, and they are the museum's 2 founders. They worked very, very hard and created the museum that you see today. Very sadly, Kate had to withdraw from the committee before the museum opened, and this is the big tragedy of Kate Marsden's story. She put in more work than Reverend Thompson.
In this part of the world, to this very day, Kate Marsden is used to inspire new generations to change the world around them for the better. That's an enviable legacy by anyone's standards. And yet there's more. In 1894, Kate Marsden helped to establish the St. Francis Leprosy Guild in London. And that's an organisation that is still operational today, working worldwide to rid humanity of leprosy once and for all.
My name is Коля. I am 17. Несомненно, Кейт Марсден оставил незабываемый след в истории Вилюйского, и не только Вилюйского, но и всего республики. В далекие времена она была сестрой милосердия. Она лечила людей, она также лечила всех во время войны.
Кейт Марсден сестра милосердия болар Англия курдыгыраак сиртен бүлүгө айынан келбите гарахана яна тулуян. Биһи колледж бытыгар киняхан аллах стипендия бар. Үчөйдү көрөнөр научный үленен жарыктанар оголорго ол стипендияны анылар.
Кейт Марсден сестра милосердия курдук саха силигер калан оты көрдөн эмте хотом бүлү улуугар калан Сосновка приказа ырылак жоннору калан эмтебде кини соготох калан эмтебде жоннор
Сосновка өлелебет англичанка
Англиятан калбет медик верахтак бираз Anna sirihinen toh empega kardavit onna manna biluga karbet onna Sosnovka gırılaqtaran baratan aranırılaqtara homoybot onna emtavit Thincha agoshish behan taqsusulga oni hismayga taravit
aranırılaq dönürü emtavit
Bihi kini biluga kalan Тоқ церковь туттарбыта араңырыны эмтәбите. Онна әлбәх үтөнең орбыта буйча бүлүгә охтактырга.
Она столкнулась с болезнью, которую можно было вылечить с травой, которая растет в Вилюйском улусе, да? Ага. Она узнала, что эта трава растет в Вилюйском улусе и направилась сюда. По пути она находилась в сложном пути, приключений было у нее достаточно, так скажем.
Когда мы касаемся ее биографии, то видим, что, конечно, ее труды и деятельность незаслуженно забыты, или, по крайней мере, не столь широко известны в наши дни. И видя на примере Кейт Марсден, как она преодолевала трудности, которые ставила перед ней жизнь, и как она могла быть в добрых отношениях и с представителями своих соотечественников в Великобритании, хотя здесь тоже не все принимали ее с распростертыми объятиями, как она могла наладить контакты с новой, незнакомой для нее жизнью в российской глубинке. Мы на ее примере должны научиться тоже преодолевать те трудности, которые не только стоят перед каждым из нас, и иногда возникают и в отношениях между нашими странами, между нашими церквями. Вот именно пример доброго и конструктивного сотрудничества, который явлен в служении Кейт Марсден, должен стать девизом для созидания полезных и взаимовыгодных отношений между нашими культурами в наши дни.
The world needs to know about Kate Marsden today because she's a hero, and we need heroes in our world. And she was absolutely the truest hero whose life was removed from a public view because of this scandal that there was. And I feel so sorry for her in her lifetime. She doesn't see how we celebrate her now. She helped make lives of lepers better. But more than that, her kindness as a nurse, her success as a nurse, her teaching and everything she did showed her to be a really, truly good person and also one of the greatest explorers we've ever known.
I think Kate Marsden has a lot to teach the future generations and our generations. She was such an altruistic person, so very selfless in everything that she did. So she undertook all these incredible hardships that we couldn't even conceive of in conditions that we don't even recognise nowadays, with the sole intention of helping people less fortunate than herself and trying to improve the living conditions of lepers up in remote Siberia, where they were really suffering.
She still exists in today in our remembrance of her, but also in the mission which we have, which is the very same as the one that she founded, with the difference that there is now a cure for leprosy. And what we are trying to do by following in her footsteps is make sure that once and for all we create what she imagined all those years ago, a leprosy-free world.
Well, I think she's a fantastic character who has been overlooked because she disappeared from the museum's history when we opened in 1914. We haven't really celebrated her great contribution to the town, and of course she's a character of worldwide significance, and of course with her expedition to Siberia, that was really important for the people in Siberia, but it was really important for her readers around the world to find out about a part of the world that they didn't know much about. So she's a hero, a very courageous lady, and I think that's worth celebrating.
Spending time here in Yakutia, where the memory of Kate Marsden is treated with such respect, reverence and gratitude, I can't help but wonder, if she could see this, would she feel that she finally had got her vindication?